You know, there's something rather unsettling that people notice about those who've awakened spiritually. They become unreachable, not physically distant, but emotionally untouchable in a way that's difficult to describe. The buttons that used to work don't work anymore. The hooks that used to catch don't catch. The manipulations that used to succeed just slide off. And people find this deeply disturbing. They're used to being able to get an emotional reaction, used to guilt working, shame having power, anger provoking response. But suddenly they're dealing with someone who won't react, who stays calm when they're supposed to get upset, who remains centered when they're supposed to lose balance, who simply won't be moved. And the first thought people have is, this person has become cold. They've lost their humanity. They've shut down emotionally. They don't care anymore. Something is wrong with them. But what if that's completely wrong? What if this emotional untouchability isn't coldness at all? What if it's actually what emotional maturity looks like? What if awakened people haven't become less feeling, but have simply stopped being controlled by feelings, especially other people's feelings? Carl Jung understood this phenomenon better than almost anyone. Throughout his work on individuation, he observed a consistent pattern. As people became more conscious, they became emotionally independent in a way that others found threatening. They stopped being available for the emotional games that most relationships are built on. They stopped reacting the way they used to. They stopped being manipulatable through guilt or shame or fear. And if you've noticed this happening to you, if people are calling you cold or distant, you need to keep watching, because what's actually happening is something completely different. Jung called this the development of the self, the shift from being ruled by unconscious emotional reactions to being centered in conscious awareness. And it doesn't make someone less human, it makes them more fully human. But to people who are still unconscious, this centeredness looks like coldness, feels like rejection, seems like something has gone terribly wrong, when actually something has finally gone right. Let me show you exactly what's happening, and why awakened people become emotionally untouchable in ways that have nothing to do with being cold. The first thing that makes awakened people emotionally untouchable: they've seen through manipulation. Before awakening, someone could be manipulated through their emotions, guilt them into compliance, anger them into reaction, shame them into submission. The unconscious person has emotional buttons, and anyone can press them to get a desired response. But awakened people have done something crucial. They've seen these patterns, they've recognized how they were being manipulated, they've observed their automatic reactions. And through that observation, the automatic response has been disrupted. The button is still there, but pressing it doesn't do anything anymore. Someone tries to guilt them, and they feel the guilt arise, but they don't act from it. They observe it. They recognize, this is guilt. This is someone trying to make me feel responsible for their feelings. Now here's what most people don't understand about this change, and missing this could cost you years of doubting yourself. And I'm not responsible for their feelings. The guilt is felt, but it's not obeyed. The emotion doesn't control the action anymore. This is what Jung meant by holding the tension of opposites. The awakened person can feel guilt without being controlled by guilt, can feel anger without acting from anger, can feel fear without being ruled by fear. They've developed what Jung called the observing ego, the part of consciousness that can watch emotions arise without being swept away by them. And to someone who's trying to manipulate them, this looks like coldness, because they're expecting the guilt to produce compliance, the anger to produce reaction. When it doesn't work, when the person remains calm and centered, the manipulator thinks something is wrong with them. But nothing is broken. Something has actually been fixed. The automatic emotional reactivity that made manipulation possible has been replaced by conscious awareness. And that consciousness, to an unconscious person, looks like dysfunction, when actually it's the highest form of psychological health. This is emotional maturity, not emotional death. And once you understand how they see through manipulation, you'll understand the second thing. They have learned to distinguish false guilt from true guilt. Guilt is the primary currency of most relationships. It's how parents control adult children, how partners manipulate each other, how society enforces conformity. Guilt is the invisible leash that keeps people in line. But awakened people have seen through guilt. They've recognized it for what it is, someone else's discomfort that they're trying to make you responsible for. Someone else's expectations that you didn't meet. Someone else's needs that you're not fulfilling. And they've realized, I'm not responsible for other people's feelings. I'm not obligated to meet others' expectations. I'm not required to fulfill needs I never agreed to fulfill. Jung talked about what he called false guilt versus true guilt. False guilt is feeling bad because you didn't meet someone else's expectations. And here's what's crucial. This isn't about becoming selfish or uncaring. It's about something completely different. Stay with me. True guilt is feeling bad because you violated your own values. Awakened people have learned to distinguish between these. They still feel true guilt when they act against their own integrity. But false guilt, guilt imposed from outside, doesn't stick anymore. Someone says, I'm so disappointed you're not coming. Before awakening, this would produce guilt. The person would feel bad, would second-guess their decision. But after awakening, they hear the disappointment. They acknowledge it. But they don't take responsibility for it. They don't feel obligated to change their plans because someone else is disappointed. This looks like coldness to the person expressing disappointment, because they're used to disappointment producing guilt, and guilt producing compliance. When that mechanism doesn't work, it seems like they don't care, like they've become selfish. But what's actually died is the unconscious agreement to be responsible for others' feelings. And what's been born is healthy boundaries. The ability to say no without drowning in guilt. This is freedom, not dysfunction. Now here's the third thing that makes them untouchable. And this one confuses people because it looks like disconnection. They've lost their taste for drama. Drama is the lifeblood of unconscious relationships. The fights that reestablish connection, the crises that prove people care, the emotional intensity that substitutes for genuine intimacy, and awakened people just won't participate anymore. Not because they don't care, but because they see drama for what it is. Unconscious emotional patterns playing out. Repetitive cycles that go nowhere. Energy spent on surface turbulence instead of depth. And they've lost their taste for it. They've discovered something deeper, quieter, more real. And drama feels like junk food when you've tasted real nourishment. Jung talked about how unconscious people are addicted to intensity, because they confuse intensity with aliveness. Now here's what people miss about why this happens. And understanding this changes everything. They need emotional peaks and valleys to feel like they're living. Calm feels like death. Peace feels like emptiness. So they create drama, consciously or unconsciously, to generate the intensity they're addicted to. But awakened people have discovered something. You can feel deeply alive without intensity. You can experience profound emotion without drama. You can have genuine connection without crisis. They've found what Jung called the still center, a place of deep aliveness that doesn't require external stimulation to be felt. So, when someone tries to create drama, starts a fight, manufactures a crisis, the awakened person doesn't engage. Not because they don't care, but because they recognize the pattern. They see it's not real communication. It's a habitual pattern, a familiar dance, and they simply decline to play. This drives drama-addicted people crazy because they need the other person to engage for the drama to work. And when the awakened person stays calm, refuses to fight, won't get pulled into the intensity, it looks like they don't care, like they've checked out, when actually they're more present than ever, just not present for the drama. Which brings us to the fourth thing, and this is where awakened people really become untouchable in ways that baffle unconscious people. They won't play emotional games anymore, and most relationships are built on unconscious emotional games. Games where one person takes a position and the other takes the complementary position, and both act out the same script over and over. Jung studied these patterns extensively. He saw how people unconsciously seek out partners who will play the complementary role. The rescuer finds the victim. The persecutor finds the scapegoat. The caretaker finds the helpless. And if you're recognizing these patterns in your relationships right now, check out our guide, True Self-Discovery, with 24 practical reflection exercises designed to help you find your way within. Click below to get it. And both feel like they're being authentic when really they're just acting out unconscious patterns. But awakened people have seen these games. They've recognized their own role in the patterns. They've watched themselves play rescuer or victim. And through that seeing, they've stepped out of the game. They won't play anymore, can't play anymore, because you can't play a game unconsciously once you've seen it consciously. Someone tries to play poor me, presenting themselves as helpless and needing rescue. Before awakening, the person would automatically step into the rescuer role, would feel obligated to fix, to help, to save, but after awakening, they see the game. They recognize the pattern, and they refuse to play. Not out of cruelty, but out of clarity. They know that rescuing the victim keeps both people trapped, so they respond with compassion, but without rescuing. They acknowledge the difficulty, but don't take responsibility for fixing it. They offer support, but don't enable helplessness. And to the person trying to play poor me, this looks like coldness, like abandonment, like you don't care about me anymore, when actually they care enough to refuse to participate in the game that's keeping both people unconscious. This is love, not coldness, but it doesn't look like love to someone who needs the game. Now here's the most important part. The real reason awakened people become emotionally untouchable. They've integrated their shadow. This is Jung's most crucial concept. The shadow is all the parts of ourselves we've rejected, denied, repressed. The anger we weren't allowed to feel. The selfishness we were taught was bad. The aggression we learned to hide. The darkness we decided we couldn't be. And here's what happens with the unintegrated shadow. It makes you manipulatable, because people can control you by threatening to expose your shadow. They can shame you by pointing out the qualities you're trying to hide. They can guilt you by suggesting you're being selfish or angry or dark. And because you're unconscious of these parts, because you're still trying to maintain the illusion that you're only light, the threat works. But here's what changes everything. When you integrate your shadow, you become untouchable. And this is where most people completely misunderstand what's happening. You comply to avoid having your shadow revealed. But when someone has integrated their shadow, when they've owned the darkness they've been denying, they become untouchable. Jung said, "One does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious." When someone has integrated their shadow, they've acknowledged, yes, I have anger. Yes, I have selfishness. Yes, I have aggression. Yes, I have darkness. These aren't things I need to hide anymore. They're parts of me I've accepted, integrated, made conscious. I'm not ruled by them, but I'm not denying them either. They're part of my wholeness. And once someone has done this work, something remarkable happens. They can't be shamed anymore, because shame only works on the parts you're still trying to hide. Someone tries to shame them by calling them selfish, and they think, yes, I have selfishness, so what? Someone tries to manipulate them by suggesting they're being angry, and they think, yes, I feel anger, that's allowed. The shadow has been brought into consciousness, and conscious shadow can't be used against you. This is what Jung meant when he said, making the darkness conscious is how enlightenment happens. The darkness, when made conscious, loses its power to control you, and that makes you emotionally untouchable, not cold, not unfeeling, but unable to be manipulated through shame or guilt or fear. This is freedom. This is sovereignty. This is what emotional maturity actually looks like. So, what does it actually mean when someone becomes emotionally untouchable? It doesn't mean they've stopped feeling. It doesn't mean they've become cold or disconnected or unfeeling. It means they've stopped being controlled by unconscious emotional patterns, stopped being available for manipulation, stopped participating in games, stopped being ruled by guilt and shame and fear. They still feel deeply, often more deeply than before, but they feel consciously. They observe their emotions rather than being swept away by them. They experience their feelings without being controlled by them. This is what Jung called psychological wholeness, the integration of conscious and unconscious, light and shadow, emotion and awareness. And to people who are still unconscious, this wholeness looks like something is missing, because they're expecting reactions that don't come. But here's what they're actually witnessing, and this is what almost nobody realizes. They're pushing buttons that don't work. They're trying to engage emotionally in ways that used to work, but don't work anymore. And they interpret this as, the person has become cold. But what they're actually witnessing is someone who's become psychologically mature, who's developed emotional sovereignty, who's learned to be with their emotions without being ruled by them, who's integrated their shadow so they can't be shamed or manipulated, who's seen through the games and refuses to play them. This isn't dysfunction. This is the highest form of psychological health. Jung spent his entire life helping people achieve this. He called it individuation, becoming a psychologically whole individual rather than a collection of unconscious reactions. And he was very clear. Individuation separates you from the collective. It makes you different. It makes you seem strange to people still embedded in unconscious patterns. Because you're operating from consciousness while they're operating from unconsciousness. You haven't become emotionally dead. You become emotionally alive in a way most people never experience. You haven't shut down. You've woken up. And yes, that makes you untouchable. Not because you don't feel, but because you feel so deeply, so consciously, that you refuse to be controlled by feeling. Not because you don't care, but because you care enough to refuse to participate in unconscious patterns that hurt everyone involved. The buttons don't work anymore. The hooks don't catch. The manipulation slides off. Not because something is wrong with you, but because something has finally become right. You've integrated your shadow. You've withdrawn your projections. You've become conscious. And consciousness, to the unconscious world, looks like coldness, when actually, it's the warmest thing there is, the most human thing there is, the most alive thing there is. You're not emotionally dead, you're emotionally sovereign, and that sovereignty is untouchable. Welcome to wholeness. Welcome to consciousness. Welcome to being fully, authentically, undeniably yourself. The world will call you cold, but Jung would call you awake, and that's all that matters.